The scent of decaying paper and forgotten time clung to Alara Vance like a second skin, a perfume she preferred to any floral bouquet. In the heart of Boston, her small workshop was a sanctuary of silence, where the only sounds were the whisper of turning pages and the delicate scrape of her tools against brittle leather. At 22, she possessed a surgeon's precision, her slender fingers tracing the faded gilt on a 17th-century spine, breathing life back into stories that had long gone silent. She was a restorer of antique books, a mender of things left broken by the passage of years. It was a meticulous, patient existence that mirrored the careful containment of her own heart. She poured all her passion into these inanimate objects, leaving none for the vibrant, chaotic world outside her dusty window, a world she observed but never truly felt a part of. Her life was a carefully curated collection of quiet duties and unspoken obligations, a fortress built against the specter of emotional chaos. But what secret fear keeps a young woman locked in such a silent, gilded world, mending the lives of others while her own remains unwritten? If you wish to uncover the truth that binds her, and the desperate plea that could shatter her reality, I invite you to watch until the end. Please consider subscribing to our channel and letting us know in the comments where you are watching from. We continue. The truth of her condition was a secret she held closer than any rare manuscript. At 22, she remained untouched. A virgin not by religious conviction but by a profound, paralyzing fear. She carried the memory of her mother's great, passionate love affair like a cautionary tale, a brilliant flame that had ended in the cold ashes of heartbreak and social ruin. From this, Alara had learned a devastating lesson. Desire was a destructive force, a beautiful poison that promised ecstasy but delivered only disgrace. She had chosen numbness as a shield, believing that a heart that never opens can never be broken. This self-imposed exile from intimacy had left her emotionally pristine, but achingly hollow, a perfect, unopened book on a shelf, gathering dust. This carefully constructed emptiness was soon to be filled, not by love but by duty. Her engagement to a respectable family friend, a man whose presence was as steady and uninspiring as a metronome, was the cornerstone of her family's plan for redemption. The Vance name, once prominent, now teetered on the precipice of financial collapse, and this loveless union was their only lifeline. The diamond on her finger felt less like a promise, and more like a beautifully crafted manacle, cold and heavy against her skin. She would look at it under the soft glow of her restoration lamp, seeing not a future of shared warmth but a lifetime of polite smiles and silent compromises, a gilded cage designed to restore her family standing while ensuring her own spirit remained permanently confined within its bars. She was a sacrifice, elegantly prepared for an altar of social expectation. The weight of this sacrifice was a constant, oppressive presence in her family's cramped apartment, a space that seemed to shrink with every passing day. The faded grandeur of their inherited furniture served as a constant reminder of what they had lost. She saw the desperation etched into the fine lines around her mother's eyes, heard it in the forced cheerfulness of her father's voice. They never spoke of it directly, but the expectation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Her marriage was their salvation, her personal happiness, a small price to pay for the restoration of their legacy. Alara understood her role with a clarity that bordered on despair. She was the final, precious asset to be liquidated, her future traded for their security. This unspoken pact bound her more tightly than any vow, a silent, crushing contract of filial piety. Back in the solitude of her workshop, the familiar scent of old vellum and glue no longer felt like a comfort, but an accusation. The silence, once a peaceful companion, now amplified the frantic, trapped beating of her own heart. Dust motes danced in the slivers of afternoon light, each one a tiny, carefree speck in a world she couldn't join. They moved with a freedom she had never known. She would hold a fragile, water-damaged page, her hands steady and sure as she coaxed it back from the brink of oblivion. Yet when she thought of her own life, of the hands of a man she did not love, a tremor would start in her fingers, a deep, cellular rebellion against the path laid out before her. Her craft was a cruel irony. She could mend anything but the fracture within her own soul. As evening bled across the Boston skyline, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange, Alara would often find herself staring out her window, her gaze drifting north towards the stately, imposing mansions of Beacon Hill. She didn't know why her eyes were drawn to that bastion of old money and new power, a world so far removed from her own. It was an unconscious pull, a magnetic yearning for something she couldn't name. A storm was gathering on the horizon, mirroring the tempest brewing inside her. The first drops of rain began to streak the dusty glass, like tears for a life she hadn't yet lived and was already being forced to mourn. She felt a profound and unsettling premonition that the quiet, ordered world she had so carefully constructed was about to be irrevocably shattered. The walk home was a daily pilgrimage through a city that wore its history like a shroud. Alara traced the familiar cobblestone streets of the North End, her worn leather boots silent on the uneven ground. She passed brick townhouses with gas lamps flickering to life, their warm, amber glow illuminating windows that offered glimpses into other lives of casual comfort and unburdened laughter. Boston, for her, was not a place of revolutionary freedom, but a labyrinth of expectations, its narrow streets closing in on her. The salty air from the harbor carried the scent of brine and distance, a cruel reminder of a wider world she could only imagine. She felt like a ghost haunting the edges of her own existence, her destination not a home, but a stage where she was expected to perform the role of the dutiful daughter, a part that was slowly erasing the woman she might have been. The weight of her family's past and their precarious future settled upon her shoulders with every step, a burden as tangible as the satchel of restoration tools she carried. The Vance apartment was a shrine to a bygone era, a cramped space choked with the ghosts of prosperity. Heavy mahogany furniture, scarred with the marks of time and hasty moves, dominated the small living room, its dark wood absorbing what little light filtered through the tall, grimy windows. The Persian rug was threadbare in the pathways between the door and the kitchen, a map of their constrained lives. Her mother insisted on polishing the family silver every Saturday, its gleam a desperate defiance against the encroaching dust and decay. It sat in a locked cabinet, a treasure they could no longer afford to use but couldn't bear to part with. Ilara saw the apartment not as a sanctuary, but as a mausoleum of their former standing. Every object whispered of their decline, a constant, suffocating chorus that reminded her of the price required to silence it. Her own future, sold for the quiet dignity of polished silver and a name restored to its former luster. Her mother, Eleanor, moved through the space with a brittle, bird-like energy, her hands never still. She would be arranging wilting flowers in a crystal vase, or compulsively dusting a porcelain figurine, her movements a frantic ballet against entropy. "Arthur called," she'd say, her voice a carefully constructed melody of casualness that failed to mask the sharp edge of anxiety beneath. He was asking about the catering for the engagement party. Such a thoughtful man, always thinking ahead. Eleanor never looked directly at Ilara when she spoke of the marriage. Her gaze would fix on some distant point, as if she were admiring a beautiful portrait rather than discussing her daughter's life. In these moments, Ilara felt less like a person and more like a carefully negotiated treaty, a living contract whose terms were her family's survival. Her mother's love was a cage woven from threads of duty and sacrifice, each one pulling tighter around Ilara's heart. Her father, Richard, was the silent, gravitational center of the family's despair. He would sit in his worn armchair, the newspaper held up like a shield, the rustle of its pages, the only sound he contributed to the evening. He had once been a man of boisterous laughter and grand plans, but a series of failed investments had whittled him down to this quiet, defeated figure. The shame of their situation had settled deep into his bones, and he could no longer meet his daughter's eyes. He saw in her not the child he had cherished, but the reflection of his own failure, and the final, terrible solution to it. His silence was a form of abdication, a surrender of his paternal role. He had handed the responsibility for their salvation to Ilara, and the unspoken weight of his disappointment was a far heavier burden than any spoken command. She was a constant, living reminder of everything he had lost and the high price of getting it back. Dinner was a ritual of quiet desperation. They ate simple stews and roasted vegetables, meals of economy served on fine china plates rimmed with faded gold. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was deafening in the silence, each scrape and tap a punctuation mark in an unwritten conversation of fear and obligation. Her parents would speak of trivialities, the weather, a neighbor's gossip, the rising cost of bread, all while the monumental subject of Ilara's impending marriage sat at the table with them, an invisible but ravenous guest. They would praise Arthur's stability, his respectable family, his promising career in finance. They described her future as if it were a sound investment portfolio, balanced and secure. Ilara would chew her food slowly, the taste turning to ash in her mouth, feeling the cold, inexorable calculus of her life being laid out before her, a transaction where her heart was the currency. One night, unable to sleep, she had crept past her parents' bedroom and heard their voices, hushed and sharp with worry. Her father's tone was ragged, stripped of its usual reserve. "There's nothing left, Eleanor. The creditors are calling daily." Her mother's reply was a fierce, desperate whisper, a sound like tearing silk. "She is all we have left. Arthur's family will make this go away. It has to be enough. She has to be enough." The words had pierced Ilara's heart, not with the shock of revelation, but with the cold, hard finality of confirmation. She was not their daughter. She was their last asset, the final piece on a chessboard where they had already been checkmated. She had backed away from the door, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet, and understood that the love she had always believed in was conditional, its survival dependent on her willingness to be sacrificed. Her own bedroom offered no escape. It was a small, cloistered space, still decorated with the pale, floral wallpaper of her girlhood. The single window looked out not onto a sweeping city vista, but directly onto the weathered brick wall of the adjacent building, a suffocating, featureless expanse that mirrored her own lack of options. It was a view without a horizon, a future without possibility. This room, which should have been her sanctuary, felt like a holding cell. The books piled on her nightstand were her only companions, their tales of adventure and passionate love, a form of exquisite torture. She would trace the names of brave heroines with her fingertip, women who defied kings and crossed oceans for love, and feel a profound, bottomless sense of shame. They were characters in stories, while she was merely a footnote in her family's ledger. The inevitable phone call from Arthur would come around 8 o'clock, his voice a steady, predictable drone on the other end of the line. He spoke of mutual funds, of the seating chart for their wedding reception, of the sensible beige they had chosen for the living room walls of their future home. He never asked about her work, her passions, or the deep, quiet sadness he must have seen in her eyes. To him, she was a component of a well-planned life, a beautiful and appropriate partner who would fulfill her role with quiet grace. Ilara would murmur her assent. "Yes, that sounds lovely, Arthur," her voice sounding distant and foreign to her own ears. Each conversation was like having a layer of soil shoveled onto her, burying her alive in a life of comfortable, passionless security. She would hang up the phone feeling hollowed out, a beautiful, empty vessel waiting to be filled with another person's expectations. After one such call, her mother entered her room without knocking, a habit that underscored Ilara's lack of privacy. Eleanor carried a porcelain box that had belonged to Ilara's grandmother. "I wanted you to have this," she said, her voice soft and persuasive. "It's for your wedding day." Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a delicate pearl necklace. As Eleanor fastened it around Ilara's neck, her cool fingers brushed against her skin, a touch that felt more like a claim than a caress. "You will be a beautiful bride," Eleanor whispered, her reflection meeting Ilara's in the small vanity mirror. "You are making this family whole again. You are our saving grace." The words were meant to be a blessing, but they landed like a curse, entwining love with obligation so tightly that Ilara could no longer tell them apart. The pearls felt as heavy as stones around her neck. Alone once more, Ilara stared at the stranger in the mirror. The woman looking back had her eyes, her mouth, but her expression was one of profound resignation. The pearls glowed with a soft, predatory light against her skin. She slowly raised her left hand, the diamond on her finger catching the lamplight and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny, brilliant pieces. It was a cold, beautiful fire, a promise of security that felt like a life sentence. A single, silent tear traced a path down her cheek, a small, hot rebellion against the gilded cage that was closing around her. The city hummed outside her window, a world teeming with life and choice and chaos, but for Ilara, there was only the suffocating silence of her room and the chilling certainty that her life was no longer her own to write. The book of her future had already been authored, bound, and sold. The call came on a Tuesday, an intrusion of the modern world into her analog sanctuary. It was not a client, but an assistant, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth, speaking from an office that Ilara imagined as a landscape of glass and chrome. The name mentioned was Julian Thorne, a name that echoed in the city's financial pages like a distant, powerful myth, the reclusive tech billionaire, the ghost of Beacon Hill. The commission was unusual, the restoration of a single private family volume. The proposed fee was a figure so staggering it seemed like a misprint, a number that could erase every debt, silence every whispered worry, and rewrite her family's entire future. Ilara felt a cold knot of dread and fascination tighten in her stomach. This wasn't a job offer, it was a summons from a king in a glass castle, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she had no choice but to answer it. The journey to his address was a slow, deliberate ascent into another reality. She left the familiar, lived-in brick and cobblestone of her own neighborhood and entered the rarefied air of Beacon Hill, where history was not a burden, but a pedigree. The townhouses stood like silent, aristocratic sentinels, their black shutters like closed eyes, guarding the secrets of Boston's oldest money and its newest, most formidable power. Ilara walked, her satchel containing her finest tools held tight against her side, feeling like an interloper in a foreign land. The very silence here was different. It was the polished, heavy silence of immense wealth, a quiet that didn't soothe but intimidated. With every step up the steep, gaslit streets, she felt her own world shrinking, her own worth diminishing, until she was nothing more than a humble artisan about to be granted an audience with an emperor. The mansion was not a home, it was a statement. A sheer facade of dark granite and vast panes of glass, it loomed over the historic street, an aggressive monument to the 21st century dropped into the heart of the 19th. It absorbed the afternoon light rather than reflecting it, a black hole of architectural ambition. There were no welcoming flower boxes, no softened edges, only the cold, clean lines of absolute power and control. A silent housekeeper, dressed in a severe gray uniform, led Ilara through an entryway that felt more like a corporate atrium than a foyer. The floors were polished concrete, the walls were stark white, and the only art was a single, massive, abstract painting of chaotic black slashes against a gray canvas. The air was cool and still, carrying no scent of food or life, only the faint, sterile smell of electronics and glass cleaner. It was the immaculate tomb of a very wealthy man. He appeared without a sound, emerging from a shadow in the cavernous library she was led to. Julian Thorne was taller than she had expected, his presence filling the space with a quiet, gravitational pull. He was dressed in a simple dark sweater and trousers, an attire that did nothing to soften the sharp, intelligent severity of his features. His face was a study in controlled planes and angles, but it was his eyes that captured her. They were a pale, arctic gray, startlingly light against his dark hair, and they held the unnerving stillness of a predator. They assessed her with a rapid, dispassionate intelligence, cataloging her worn boots, her simple dress, her steady hands. There was no warmth in his gaze, no conventional welcome, only a profound, soul-deep weariness that seemed at odds with the immense power he so clearly wielded. He was a man encased in ice, and she felt a chill creep over her skin. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that was as devoid of inflection as the rest of him. It was a statement, not a greeting. He gestured toward a massive oak table that dominated the center of the library, the only piece of antique furniture in the entire visible house. Upon its polished surface, resting on a velvet cloth, was a book. "This is the reason you are here." He did not speak of its value or its history, but his tone implied that it was a matter of life and death. The library itself was a contradiction, lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves packed not with books but with servers, their faint, rhythmic blinking lights the only pulse in the silent room. It was a repository of data, not stories, a fact that made the ancient volume on the table seem even more like a sacrificial offering on a cold, digital altar. She approached the table slowly, her professional instincts overriding her intimidation. The book was a grimoire, its leather binding cracked and peeling, the corners blunted by centuries of neglect and perhaps violence. The cover was bare, save for a faded, almost invisible sigil embossed in the center. A heavy iron clasp, rusted and broken, hung uselessly from its side. It radiated a palpable sense of sorrow, an artifact of deep and troubled history. Ilara could feel the weight of the secrets held within its water-damaged, foxed pages, without even opening it. Julian watched her, his expression unreadable, as she gently ran a gloved finger over the brittle spine. "It has been in my family for generations," he stated, the words carrying the weight of a confession rather than a proud declaration of lineage. "It is damaged." The word hung in the air, clearly referring to more than just the book. "The moisture damage is severe," Ilara said, her voice softer than she intended, a quiet murmur in the vast, silent room. "The spine will need to be completely rebuilt, but the pages seem salvageable." She looked up, intending to meet his gaze with professional confidence, but the intensity she found there made her breath catch. He wasn't looking at the book anymore. He was looking at her, his gray eyes searching her face with a raw, desperate focus that was profoundly unnerving. It felt as though he were trying to read her soul, to assess the very fabric of her character. "I can restore it," she added, her voice faltering slightly. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "I am aware of your skills, Miss Vance. That is why you were chosen." The word, chosen, sent another shiver through her, suggesting a purpose far beyond simple restoration. As she reached out to gently test the fragility of the front cover, her fingers brushed against his. He had moved without her noticing, his hand resting near the broken clasp as if guarding it. The contact was fleeting, a whisper of warmth against her skin, but it sent a sharp, electric jolt straight through her. It was a shocking spark of life in the sterile coldness of the room, a sensation so foreign and potent that she instinctively pulled her hand back as if burned. She saw a flicker in his eyes, a momentary disruption in their icy calm, before his expression became shuttered once more. He did not move away. The space between their hands, now separated by a mere inch of air, crackled with a sudden, inexplicable tension. In that single, accidental touch, a silent conversation had taken place, one of desire, fear, and a terrifying shared loneliness. Julian stepped back, breaking the spell, and moved to stand before one of the vast floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. From this vantage point, Boston was laid out below like a map, a world he owned but did not inhabit. Ilara began her preliminary examination of the grimoire, her hands moving with their practiced, delicate precision, but she could feel his gaze on her. It was a heavy, constant pressure on the back of her neck. He was observing her every movement, the gentle way she lifted a fragile page, the focused reverence she brought to her work. She was under a microscope, being analyzed not just as a craftsman, but as a specimen. She understood with a chilling intuition that he was looking for something within her, a quality of spirit or character that had nothing to do with her ability to mend paper and everything to do with the deep, ancient damage in him. When her initial assessment was complete, she packed a few sample fragments to test in her workshop, her movements precise and automatic. The transaction was concluded with the cold efficiency of a business deal, a contract signed, a bank transfer initiated. As the housekeeper escorted her out of the silent fortress, Ilara felt as if she were surfacing from a deep, cold body of water, gasping for air. The city streets, once intimidating, now felt vibrant and alive. But she could not shake the feeling of Julian Thorne's Arctic gaze, or the memory of that brief, shocking touch. The commission was a lifeline for her family, a gilded key that would unlock them from their prison of debt. Yet as she walked away from the glass and granite mansion, she knew she had stepped into a different kind of cage, one far more complex and dangerous, where the currency was not money, but something far more intimate and terrifying. Her subsequent visits to the mansion on Beacon Hill became a series of carefully choreographed encounters, each one tightening an invisible thread between her and its enigmatic master. Julian Thorne was a constant, silent presence in the library as she worked. He would sit for hours in a stark leather armchair across the room, a laptop open but untouched on his knees, his arctic gray eyes fixed on her. She felt his gaze not as a violation, but as a physical weight, a focused, analytical pressure that seemed to penetrate her skin and map the delicate movements of her hands. Under his scrutiny, the familiar act of restoration became a performance. She was acutely aware of the line of her neck as she bent over her work, the soft whisper of her clothes as she shifted, the way a stray lock of hair fell across her cheek. This hyper-awareness was both unnerving and intoxicating, a silent, charged dialogue in a room devoid of sound. He began to break his self-imposed silence, not with personal inquiries, but with terse, almost clinical questions about her process. "What is the chemical composition of that adhesive?" he asked one afternoon, his voice cutting through the stillness. Ilara explained the archival-grade paste, her own voice sounding breathy and foreign in the vast space. She detailed the careful balance of wheat starch and deionized water, the science behind its neutrality. He listened with an unnerving intensity, as if her explanation held some deeper meaning, a formula to mend more than just paper. After she finished, a long, resonant silence fell between them, heavier and more intimate than any conversation. It was a silence filled with the things they couldn't say, a shared space where his desperate search for a solution and her burgeoning, terrifying curiosity met and held each other in a fragile truce. One sweltering July day, while carefully separating two pages that had been fused together by moisture, Ilara uncovered a faint inscription in the margin, written in a delicate, looping cursive. It was not the spidery, aggressive script she had come to associate with the Thornmen. This was a woman's hand, and the words were a plea. "May God have mercy on this house, and on the man I love within it." A strange, cold sensation washed over Ilara, a feeling she couldn't immediately name but which felt disturbingly like possessiveness. This book, this man's history, had become her territory. The discovery of this unknown woman's grief felt like an intrusion, a ghost from his past stepping between them. She felt an irrational pang of jealousy for a long-dead woman, for a love and a pain that had preceded her, and it shocked her with its intensity. She held the page up to the light, her heart beating a little faster. "There's an inscription here," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The handwriting is different." Julian was at her side in an instant, his movement so swift and silent it startled her. He looked down at the faded ink, and for a fleeting moment, his mask of cold composure dissolved completely. She saw a flicker of raw, undisguised agony in his eyes, a wound torn open anew. "It is nothing," he said, his voice clipped and harsh, the wall of ice slamming back into place. "A sentimental folly. Ignore it." But she couldn't ignore the tremor in his hand as he gestured toward the page, nor the way he immediately retreated to the far side of the room, turning his back to her as he stared out at the city below, a solitary king in a glass tower, besieged by his own history. The atmosphere during her next session was thick with unspoken tension. Julian remained in the library, a sentinel at his post, but he kept a deliberate, almost painful distance. He positioned his chair near the doorway, as if to ensure a clear path of escape. He no longer watched her hands. He watched the book itself, his gaze fixed on the grimoire with a mixture of hatred and desperate need. Ilara felt his withdrawal as a physical loss, a sudden drop in temperature in the already cool room. She had inadvertently touched a nerve, a source of his deep, internal damage, and he had recoiled like a wounded animal. The silence between them was no longer a space of shared curiosity, but a chasm of his making, and she felt a desperate, reckless urge to find a way to cross it, to reach the man hiding behind the fortress of his own pain. Unwilling to endure the suffocating quiet, Ilara began to speak, her voice a soft murmur that barely disturbed the air. She described the art of papermaking in medieval Europe, the subtle differences between vellum and parchment, the way a book could hold the memory of a reader's touch for centuries. She spoke not to him, but to the room, to the book, to herself. It was a nervous, rambling monologue about the only thing in the world she truly loved and understood. She didn't dare look at him, but she could feel the subtle shift in the room's energy. His rigid posture seemed to soften. The relentless tapping of his finger on his laptop ceased. He was listening, and in his stillness she felt a profound, rapt attention that was more intimate than any spoken word. She was filling his sterile, digital world with the scent of old leather and the texture of human history. A sudden summer thunderstorm broke over the city, the sky turning a bruised, dramatic shade of indigo. Rain lashed against the massive plate-glass windows, the sound isolating them from the world outside, cocooning them in the library's silent, dimly lit space. The storm was a mirror of the tempest brewing between them. As dusk fell prematurely, the lights in the mansion flickered once, twice, then died, plunging them into a deep twilight broken only by the rhythmic flash of lightning and the soft blue glow of the server racks lining the walls. The sudden darkness was disorienting, stripping away the formal boundaries of their arrangement. They were no longer a billionaire and a craftsman. They were just a man and a woman, trapped together in a storm, surrounded by the ghosts of his past. The air grew thick, heavy with possibility. In the semi-darkness, his voice came from much closer than she expected. He was standing near her work table, a tall, imposing silhouette against the storm-lit window. "Why do you do it?" he asked, his tone stripped of its usual guardedness, leaving only a raw, quiet vulnerability. "Why spend your life mending things that are broken and forgotten?" The question had nothing to do with her profession. It was a desperate, personal inquiry. He was asking if something as damaged as him, as his family, as the cursed book that was his legacy, could ever truly be made whole. He was asking if she believed in redemption. Alara's breath caught in her throat. He was no longer looking at her as a potential cure, but as a potential confessor, and the weight of that trust was both terrifying and exhilarating. She found her voice in the darkness, her answer coming from a place of deep, instinctual truth she didn't know she possessed. "Because nothing is ever truly lost," she whispered, her words aimed at the shadow before her. "The damage becomes part of the story. Restoring something isn't about erasing the past. It's about making it strong enough to have a future." She looked up, and in a flash of lightning she saw his face, his expression unguarded, his eyes wide with a desperate, searching hunger. Her words, meant to describe her craft, had landed like a prophecy, offering a sliver of hope to a man who had clearly abandoned it long ago. He stared at her as if she had just spoken a forgotten, sacred language, one his soul had been starving to hear. The space between them shimmered with a new, profound intensity. He took a step closer, the distance between them shrinking to a mere breath. The scent of rain and his clean, sharp cologne filled her senses, a dizzying combination. He reached out, his hand hovering over the book, over the page she had just been mending. His fingers, long and elegant, trembled almost imperceptibly as he traced the line of a repaired tear, his touch impossibly gentle. His fingertips stopped just a millimeter from her own, which still rested on the parchment. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, a magnetic pull that rooted her to the spot. The world narrowed to that single, charged point of near contact. Time seemed to stop, suspended in the silent, electric space between their hands. To close that gap would be to cross a line from which there would be no return. Suddenly the power surged back on, flooding the library with harsh, unforgiving light. The moment shattered. They both recoiled as if burned, Julian snatching his hand back and stepping away, the mask of cool indifference crashing back down over his features. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, the phantom sensation of his warmth still tingling on her skin. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the restored silence. "The storm seems to be passing," he said, his voice once again the flat, emotionless baritone of their first meeting. He turned and walked to the window, his back to her a rigid wall of denial. But the memory of the darkness, of his vulnerability and their almost touch, now hung permanently in the air between them, a ghost of what had almost been, and a promise of what still could be. That night, Alara sat through a strained dinner with her parents and Arthur. Her fiancé spoke animatedly about market trends and the logistics of their upcoming engagement party, his voice a dull, meaningless drone in her ears. She looked at his pleasant, untroubled face, at the predictable kindness in his eyes, and felt a profound, suffocating sense of dread. He was a safe harbor, a sturdy, reliable vessel that would carry her and her family to financial security. But her soul had been awakened to the thrill of a storm, to the terrifying allure of a deep, dangerous ocean. The thought of a lifetime in Arthur's calm, shallow waters now felt like a drowning. The diamond on her finger felt heavier than ever, a beautiful, cold anchor pulling her down into a life she was no longer sure she could bear to live. The choice, which had once seemed so clear, had become a source of torment. On one side stood duty, family, and a life of quiet, respectable security, the path she had been conditioned to believe was her only option. On the other side stood Julian Thorne, a man who was a locked room, a puzzle she was both terrified and desperate to solve. He represented everything she had been taught to fear: passion, chaos, emotional risk, and a power that could consume her. Yet, in his presence, she felt a terrifying, vibrant pulse of life she had never experienced before. She was standing at a crossroads, and for the first time, she understood that the real cage was not the one Julian might build around her, but the one she had been building around herself her entire life. Her phone buzzed late that night, jarring her from a restless sleep. It was an unknown number. She answered hesitantly, her heart beginning to pound. "Vance," she whispered. "You need to come back," Julian's voice said, stripped of all formality. It was raw, strained, the sound of a man at the absolute end of his tether. "There's an urgency with the grimoire." The excuse was laughably thin, a fragile veil over the raw desperation in his tone. He wasn't summoning his book restorer. He was calling out in the dark, and for some reason, he was calling for her. It wasn't a request, it was a plea, a magnetic pull she felt deep in her bones, an irresistible summons to the heart of the storm. A reckless, defiant energy surged through her. She threw on her clothes, her hands shaking not with fear but with a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. This was a choice. Her choice. She was no longer a passive object being moved around a board by her family or her fiancé. By answering his call, she was stepping into the center of her own story, walking willingly toward the danger and desire she had so long denied. She slipped out of the silent apartment, the city lights of Boston a glittering, promising path before her. Every step toward Beacon Hill was a step away from the girl she was supposed to be, and a step toward the woman she was terrified she might become. The cool night air on her skin felt like a baptism, a washing away of old fears. She found the mansion's imposing front door slightly ajar, a silent invitation into the lion's den. The house was quiet, the air still and expectant. She walked through the sterile foyer and into the library, her footsteps echoing on the polished concrete. He was there, standing by the great oak table, exactly as she had known he would be. The ancient grimoire lay open between them, its damaged pages illuminated by a single, focused lamp. But Julian wasn't looking at the book. His gaze was fixed on her, and the control he usually wielded so masterfully was gone. In his arctic eyes, she saw a desperate, terrifying combination of hunger and supplication. He looked like a drowning man who believed she was his only hope of reaching the shore, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that he was about to ask for a price she never imagined she would have to pay. "This isn't about the money," she said, her voice a quiet but unbreakable thread in the cavernous silence of the library. Her words hung in the air, a stark refutation of the crude, desperate bargain he had proposed. Julian stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and anguish, the powerful billionaire stripped bare to reveal the terrified man beneath. He had offered her a king's ransom, the only language of value he understood, and she had just rendered it meaningless. Ilara looked at him, truly looked past the fortress of his wealth, and saw the prisoner trapped within. She saw the centuries of loneliness etched into the lines of his face, the inherited curse that was not a myth, but a tangible, soul-crushing despair. In that moment her choice ceased to be a sacrifice. It became an act of profound, terrifying, and defiant liberation. With a resolve that felt both foreign and utterly intrinsic to her being, she closed the distance between them. Her worn leather boots made no sound on the cold, polished floor, but each step was a seismic shift in the foundation of her world. It was a step away from her mother's cautionary tales, away from Arthur's safe and passionless future, away from the dutiful daughter she had always been. She stopped before the great oak table, the ancient open grimoire separating them like a chasm of his family's pain. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and laid her hand not on the brittle parchment, but directly over his. The contact was a jolt of pure energy, a current of warmth against the cold, still air. His skin was surprisingly warm, alive, a shocking contrast to the icy control he projected. It was her answer, given not in words but in a touch that offered solace instead of accepting a contract. He flinched as if her touch were fire, his entire body going rigid. A storm of conflicting emotions warred in his arctic eyes. Astonishment, a fragile glimmer of hope, and a wave of deep, corrosive self-loathing. He tried to pull his hand away to retreat back into the safety of his emotional wasteland, but her gentle pressure held him fast. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice rough and broken, the sound of a name he had no right to speak with such intimacy. "You don't understand what you are doing. This will ruin you." It was not a threat, but a warning born of despair. A final, selfless attempt to protect her from himself. He was giving her one last chance to flee the darkness he inhabited, believing with every fiber of his being that he was a poison she should not dare to touch, a curse she could not possibly survive. She met his tormented gaze without fear, her own eyes conveying a message of unwavering certainty. She did not speak, for words would only cheapen the profound, unspoken language that now flowed between them. Slowly she turned his hand over and traced the lines on his palm with her fingertip, a gesture of such simple, unadorned tenderness it seemed to shatter his defenses. It was an act of mapping his pain, of accepting the broken history written into his very skin. This silent communion was her true transgression, a deeper intimacy than any physical act. She was not selling her purity. She was offering her compassion, a currency his vast fortune could never buy. She was choosing to enter his darkness not as a cure, but as a companion, and in doing so, she was finally claiming her own light. A ragged sound, something between a sob and a gasp, was torn from his chest. The last of his formidable control shattered into 1,000 pieces. He moved around the table and pulled her into his arms, his embrace not the smooth, confident gesture of a lover, but the desperate, clumsy clutch of a drowning man. He buried his face in the curve of her neck, his body trembling against hers. She could feel the frantic, panicked rhythm of his heart pounding against her own. A wild, trapped bird seeking release. The scent of him, clean, sharp, with an undercurrent of old paper and lonely nights, enveloped her, and she wrapped her arms around his back, holding him together as he seemed to fall apart. In his utter brokenness, she felt not pity, but a fierce, resonant connection, a recognition of his profound loneliness that mirrored her own. When he finally lifted his head, his face was undone, stripped of all artifice. He looked at her as if she were a miracle he could not comprehend. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks with a reverence that made her breath catch. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or seduction, but of raw, unadulterated need. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving his entire life, and she was the first sustenance he had ever known. It was desperate, searching and deeply sorrowful, a silent question asking if she was real, if this moment of connection was not just another ghost destined to fade. She responded with an instinctive gentleness, meeting his anguish with a quiet offering of her own, her lips parting in a soft, tentative surrender that was entirely her own choice. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the charged air. His eyes were squeezed shut, as if the sight of her was too much to bear. "I don't know how," he whispered, the confession a raw wound exposed to the air. "I don't know how to be gentle." The admission was devastating, a confirmation of the emotional wasteland his curse had created. For all his power, for all the worlds he could command with a line of code, he was an utter novice in the simple, human art of tenderness. He was a brilliant mind, trapped in a heart that had never been taught how to love, only how to ache. He was as untouched, in his own way, as she was, his soul a virgin territory of feeling he was terrified to explore, for fear of the damage he might cause. That raw, vulnerable confession extinguished the last embers of Ilara's fear, replacing them with a wave of profound, empowering empathy. In his admission of inadequacy, she found her own strength. She was no longer the fragile artifact to be handled, the pure object to be acquired. She was the expert here, the one who understood the language of the heart, however timidly. A fierce protective tenderness rose within her, a desire not to save him but to meet him in his brokenness. She lifted her hands, her movements now steady and sure, and framed his face. "Then let me show you," she whispered, the words a vow. She drew him down for another kiss, and this time it was she who led, her touch confident, and her lips communicating a promise of patience, of acceptance, of a shared journey into uncharted territory. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers with a desperate tightness, as if he feared she might vanish. He led her from the library, the repository of his family's sorrow, and through the cold, echoing corridors of the mansion. The journey was a silent pilgrimage from the public domain of their strange contract to the inner sanctum of his solitude. They passed rooms filled with sterile, untouched furniture and stark, modern art, a museum of a life unlived. His bedroom was a continuation of this theme, a vast, minimalist space dominated by a wall of glass that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of the glittering Boston skyline. It was the room of a man who watched the world but never felt a part of it. The only warmth came from the city lights below, a sea of anonymous, vibrant life. There, with the city as their witness, the final transgression unfolded. It was not a transaction, but a revelation, a slow, sacred disrobing of layers of fear and loneliness that had encased them both. He moved with an agonizing, unpracticed care, his hands trembling as they traced the curve of her shoulder, as if she were a priceless manuscript he was terrified of damaging. She met his hesitancy with a quiet, reassuring grace, her own hands exploring the rigid lines of his back, feeling the tension of a lifetime of guardedness. When their skin finally met, it was with a sense of profound, shocking recognition, two halves of a fractured soul finding their counterpart in the darkness. It was a collision of innocence and damage, a silent, desperate prayer that in their union they might both, finally, be made whole. The first light of dawn was a cruel, clinical thing, stripping the night of its whispered secrets and soft shadows. Ilara awoke to the cold, gray light filtering through the wall of glass in Julian's bedroom, illuminating the sterile perfection of the space. She was alone in the vast, empty bed. The warmth of his body, the memory of his desperate, trembling touch, already felt like a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there. He was standing across the room, already dressed in a severe dark suit, a figure of impenetrable authority, staring out at the waking city. The vulnerable, broken man from the library was gone, and in his place stood the ghost of Beacon Hill, his back a rigid wall of dismissal. The silence in the room was no longer intimate. It was a vacuum, cold and absolute, pulling all the warmth and life from her. The spell was not just broken. It had been methodically, brutally shattered. He did not turn to face her when he spoke, his voice a flat, dispassionate echo against the glass. "The arrangement is concluded," he stated, each word a perfectly polished, ice-cold stone dropped into the silence between them. "The funds I mentioned have been transferred to an account in your name. It should be more than sufficient to resolve your family's difficulties." He had reverted to the only language he trusted, the cold, hard calculus of finance. He was reducing the raw, terrifying intimacy they had shared, the confession in his eyes, the hesitant reverence of his touch, her own trembling surrender, to a simple, vulgar transaction. It was a shield, a brutal act of self-preservation designed to push her away, to cauterize the wound she had opened within him. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, a deliberate poisoning of the one pure, unguarded moment of his life and hers. Numbness was a mercy, a thick protective layer that allowed her to move, to gather her discarded clothes from the cold concrete floor. Each movement was detached, as if she were watching a stranger in a film. She dressed in the oppressive silence, feeling his gaze on her back, not with the heat of desire, but with the cold, analytical focus of an observer watching a finished experiment. She did not look at him as she walked out of the bedroom. The mansion, which had briefly held the promise of a shared sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum again, and she was a ghost being exorcised from its halls. The housekeeper met her in the foyer, her face a mask of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide the flicker of pity in her eyes. As Ilara stepped out into the crisp morning air of Beacon Hill, she felt irrevocably changed, branded by a night that was meant to be a liberation, but now felt like the most profound and devastating kind of violation. The Vance apartment was a pressure cooker of silent, simmering panic. Her key turning in the lock was a detonation. Her mother and Arthur were waiting in the cramped living room, their faces pale and etched with the sleepless anxiety of the long night. Arthur, his usually placid features twisted with a mixture of worry and wounded pride, stood stiffly by the fireplace. Eleanor sat perched on the edge of the sofa, a porcelain figurine about to shatter. They didn't need to ask where she had been. The truth was written all over her, in the rumpled state of her dress, the haunted look in her eyes, and the faint, foreign scent of wealth and rain that clung to her skin. Her silence was a confession, a confirmation of their worst fears. She looked down at her left hand, at the cold, brilliant diamond that was supposed to be her family's salvation, and saw it for what it was, a beautiful, hollow lie she could no longer bear to wear. "How could you?" Eleanor's voice was a ragged whisper that quickly escalated into a raw, tearing sob of accusation. "After everything we have sacrificed? Everything we have planned?" She wasn't asking about love or betrayal. She was calculating a financial loss, tallying the cost of a ruined merger. Arthur, his face ashen, finally spoke, his voice thick with a disbelief that curdled into contempt. "Was it him? That man? Thorne?" The name hung in the air like a curse. To them, Ilara's transgression was not an act of a desperate heart, but a catastrophic miscalculation, a foolish trade of a secure, respectable future for a single night with a dangerous, unpredictable variable. They saw her not as a daughter in pain, but as a failed investment, a precious asset that had been recklessly, unforgivably squandered, dragging them all down with her into the ruin she was supposed to prevent. In the suffocating storm of her mother's grief and her fiancé, as discussed, a strange, cold calm settled over Ilara. This was the final, ugly truth of their love. It was conditional, a contract with terms she had just violated, with a steady hand that did not feel like her own. She slowly pulled the heavy diamond ring from her finger. The metal was cold against her skin. She walked to the small mahogany table and placed it on the polished surface, the sound a soft, definitive click in the tense room. It was not an apology or a plea for forgiveness. It was an abdication. She was resigning from the life they had authored for her. Arthur stared at the ring, then at her, his expression hardening into that of a man looking at a complete and utter stranger. The severing was complete, a clean, brutal amputation from the life she had always known, leaving her untethered and utterly, terrifyingly alone. Miles away, in his glass fortress overlooking the city, Julian Thorne stood in his library, the restored grimoire lying open on the oak table. It was a monument to his ultimate failure. He had sought a cure, a magical loophole in the code of his own cursed DNA, and had instead found something infinitely more dangerous, a genuine connection. He had allowed her into his fortress, and for a few hours her quiet strength and gentle compassion had filled the empty spaces of his soul with a light he never knew existed. And then he had done what Thorns always do. He had destroyed it. He had pushed her away with the crudest tool he possessed, money, because the terror of keeping her, of inevitably tainting her with his own darkness, was more than he could bear. He was haunted now, not by the ghosts of his ancestors, but by the memory of her, a living ghost in his sterile, silent world. The days that followed were a study in silence. The astronomical sum of money sat in her new bank account, a digital ghost she refused to acknowledge. It was a constant, mocking reminder of the price of her choice. At home, she moved through the apartment like a phantom. Her father wouldn't meet her eyes, his shame and disappointment a palpable presence in every room. Her mother communicated only in sighs and the sharp, angry clatter of dishes. They did not cast her out physically, but they had excised her from the family narrative, leaving her in a state of emotional exile. The freedom she had so recklessly grasped for on that stormy night now felt like this, a desolate, featureless void. She was unengaged, unemployed on her grand commission, and unmoored from the family that had been her entire world. She had stepped out of her cage only to find herself lost in an endless, empty wilderness. Driven by an instinct for survival, she sought refuge in the one place that had ever felt truly her own, her workshop. The familiar scent of decaying paper and binding glue was a balm to her frayed soul. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, the world outside muted and distant. Her gaze fell upon a discarded project, a 19th-century book of poetry, its spine completely shattered, its pages a chaotic, unbound mess. It was a hopeless case she had set aside months ago. Now she picked it up with a new sense of purpose. Her hands, which had trembled in Julian's mansion, were now preternaturally steady. She began the slow, painstaking work of collation, of mending torn pages, of preparing the delicate task of rebuilding it from its very foundation. It was a quiet, deliberate act of defiance against the chaos that had consumed her life. As she worked, hour after silent hour, stitching thread through paper, coaxing order from ruin, a profound and seismic shift occurred deep within her. The crushing weight of shame began to lift, not vanishing, but transmuting into something else. It was replaced by the quiet, unyielding bedrock of her own agency. She had made a choice. A foolish, catastrophic, heartbreaking choice, perhaps, but it had been hers alone. She had not been a passive sacrifice on an altar of familial duty. She had walked willingly into the heart of the storm, driven by a flicker of hope and a terrifying, exhilarating desire. She looked at the broken book in her hands, its damage a part of its history, and understood. She, too, was damaged. But she was not destroyed. She could be mended, not back to the pristine, untouched girl she once was, but into someone new, someone stronger, someone who had survived the fire. 6 months passed, each day a quiet, deliberate stitch in the mending of her own soul. Alara never touched the principal sum Julian had deposited, that blood money she considered a poison to her new life. However, with a pragmatism that surprised her, she used the interest it generated, a small, ethically gray fraction, to lease a small storefront in a quiet, sun-drenched corner of Cambridge. She opened her own workshop, a place of light and air, worlds away from the dusty, forgotten corner she had once inhabited. She was her own woman now, her name on the lease, her future dictated by her own skilled hands. The memory of Julian was a scar, a silvery, healed-over line on her heart that no longer ached with every beat, but served as a permanent reminder of the fire she had walked through and the strength she had forged in its flames. She was no longer a restorer of other people's stories. She was finally the author of her own. Her new workshop, Vance Restoration, was a sanctuary of her own making. Sunlight streamed through the large front window, illuminating the warm grain of the wooden workbenches and the rich colors of the marbled end papers she crafted by hand. The air smelled of lemon oil, fresh paper, and the subtle, sweet scent of the tea she brewed throughout the day. Customers came and went, bringing her their cherished broken histories, family Bibles, first-edition novels, love letters bundled in faded ribbon. She treated each one with a gentle reverence, but her focus was different now. She no longer hid in her work, but took a quiet pride in it, a craftsman sharing her gift with the world. On a special shelf behind her desk sat the book of 19th-century poetry, its new spine strong and elegant, its pages whole. It was her masterpiece, a testament to the belief that even the most shattered things could be made beautiful again. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves skittered across the pavement outside, a long, black car, sleek and silent as a panther, pulled up to the curb. It was an apparition of wealth and power, utterly alien to the quiet, academic neighborhood. Ilara's hands stilled over the page she was mending, her heart seizing in her chest with a violent, familiar lurch. The back door opened, and Julian Thorne stepped out. He looked different, thinner, the sharp edges of his authority softened by a profound weariness that seemed to have settled deep into his bones. He did not approach the door. He simply stood on the sidewalk, his hands in the pockets of his dark coat, and looked at her through the plate-glass window of her shop, a ghost materializing in the bright, unforgiving light of day, bridging the impossible distance between Beacon Hill and her new, carefully constructed world. He stood there for a long time, a silent statue against the backdrop of the bustling street. He was not the predator she remembered from the library, nor the broken man from that final, devastating night. This was someone else, a man hollowed out by his own choices, his arctic eyes no longer holding the cold fire of command but the gray, empty ash of regret. He took in every detail of her shop, the neat rows of tools, the vibrant stacks of paper, the quiet, focused line of her posture. His gaze was an apology, a confession, a question all at once. He was looking at the life she had built from the ruins he had left behind, and in his stillness, Ilara felt not fear but a strange, liberating sense of pity. He was the one who was still trapped, a prisoner in a gilded cage of his own making, while she, in her small, sunlit world, was finally free. Their eyes met through the glass, and the city around them seemed to fall away into a muted silence. The space between them, a few feet of pavement and a pane of glass, felt as vast as an ocean, and as intimate as a whisper. This was their final conversation, held in a language beyond words. She saw in his gaze the acknowledgement of her strength, the sorrow for the pain he had caused, and a flicker of something she had never seen before: envy. She held his gaze, her heart steady, her expression calm. She was no longer the frightened girl, the sacrificial lamb. She was a woman who had looked into the abyss and had chosen to build a bridge back to the light. With a slow, deliberate movement, she gave a single, small nod, a gesture of release, of forgiveness, of a final, quiet closing of the book on their shared, painful history. He seemed to understand. A flicker of relief, so faint it was almost imperceptible, crossed his features. He held her gaze for one beat longer, a moment of profound, silent connection that was more honest than any touch they had ever shared. Then he mirrored her gesture, a curt, formal nod of his own, before turning and getting back into the car. It pulled away from the curb as silently as it had arrived, vanishing into the flow of traffic, a phantom returning to the shadows. Ilara watched it go, a single tear tracing a slow path down her cheek, not of sorrow but of catharsis. She turned back to her work, the sunlight warm on her hands, the future unwritten and entirely her own. If their story has touched you, and if you believe in the power of a heart to mend its own breaks, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this with someone who needs to hear it. Let us know in the comments what choices you might have made.